Um, okay. In this session, we'll be trying to discuss more about the situation of refugees in Lebanon. We'll try to stick to the time, because we have lunch after this session. We'll begin with Dr. Jihan Rabah. She's the Director of Research and Analysis, eConcordia, and the co-principal project, Someone. She's the member of UNESCO Global Chair on Prevention of Radicalization and Violent Extremism. Floor for you, Dr. Jihan.
Okay, thank you. Hi. I'm just waiting for the visuals. 1 second. Good morning, bonjour, sabah al-khair. Distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues. Before I start the session today, I would like to point to something that I saw while I was working on campus. I just noticed that on one of the boards there was a quote that said, don't dream it, you need to act upon it to become real. And I thought, wow, this is exactly what we're doing in this session. And that's amazing because in this tremulous time, we need more than ever to unite our efforts and figure out what unites us as humans. It's an honor for me to present here today as Director Research and Analysis eConcordia. We design, develop, and manage all e-learning initiatives at Concordia, including worldwide recognized MOOC courses for United Nations Environmental Sustainability Programs. With the advent of internet, multimedia, and e-learning in all educational institutions, and the way it infiltrated in our lives, it's mandatory that we produce quality learning. Not only acquire knowledge, but also construct knowledge, not only formally, but informally as well. We need to go digital, we need to be digital, but we also need to do it right. With research. I'm also honored to represent Project Someone, the Someone initiative, which has received, till now, almost $500,000 in federal funds from the Canadian government, was created to sensitize youth, educators, and the broader public to patterns of hate speech with the goal of building resilience against online hate, radicalization, within and now outside of Canada as well. Our principal investigator of Project Someone, Dr. Vivek Venkatesh, has recently been appointed as co-chair of UNESCO Global Chair in Prevention of Radicalization and Violent Extremism. And being a member of UNESCO Global Chair in Prevention of Radicalization and Violent Extremism, we are partnering with grassroots organizations worldwide to spread counter-narratives to violent extremism. And I'm super honored to be part of this team. I'm going to start with an overview of my talk. I will be discussing the following interrelated concepts regarding opportunities and challenges to counter radicalization and violent extremism initiatives. 1, I'm going to talk about broadening the definition and creating engaging spaces for communication. 2, I'm going to talk about factoring the role of social media and intimate spaces in these discussions. 3, diversifying methodologies of outreach. 4, addressing various populations in our campaigns. And finally, 5, evaluating initiatives including gender focus, and never to forget about gender even when we're evaluating initiatives that includes counter-narratives to extremism. Now, to get rid of violence, we need healing, and we need to raise consciousness everywhere. There is no single answer to everyone, right? An answer to or a solution to extremism is to understand maybe a combination of history, sociology, cultural understanding, psychology, criminology, and therefore we cannot find the solution by looking at it from a single perspective, but from a comprehensive perspective. That's an important aspect of success of any counter-narrative. We need to understand the complexity of the phenomenon and the multidimensionality of the causes behind them. Therefore, that's our starting point in any counter-radicalization effort. In light of that, we need to create engaging spaces. I call it engaging spaces because it's to foster inclusive and authentic participation and encourage public discourse on issues related to extremism and radicalization. As Foucault calls them, they are spaces called heterotopia, where spaces of equal power, where spaces where people make and shape for themselves. Engaging spaces will allow us to have that transdisciplinarity perspective, fragmentation of pedagogy into disciplinary Silos more often than not, incapacitate learners from connecting important dots, where multiple foci guide the learners to connect seemingly unrelated dots. Project Someone initiative is built around this perspective, engaging spaces, to sensitize youth, educators, and the broader public, both within and outside of Canada, to patterns of online hate. So creating online tools that help us do so is only one goal of our project. So that's why we create online forums, for example, when we teach about critical thinking. One example of that is Mosaico. It's basically a certain, based on the project Someone Think Critically project, students debate as part of class an online forum with the presence of a moderator, several community issues that demands they think critically. Now I'm going to talk about Edward Hall's and the intimate space. With the advent of technology, social media, mobile phones, tablets, and the like, the intimate space ceased to exist. Before, we used to have that intimate space, right? For example, by simply closing the door to our bedroom, we used to be alone. But now it's not the case anymore. We have the phones, right? We have social media, we have internet. We could actually never be alone. So that gives another layer of complexity, yet a new window to use and counter narratives. But while doing that, we need to be aware of the different ways social media normalizes violence. In light of that, for example, in our project, Project Someone, we provide rigorous evidence-based linguistic analysis of the patterns of hate speech on social media that promote violent extremism, as well as their associated counter-narratives which proliferate in online discussion germane to each population that we research. Now, because everything is so complex and intertwined, we need to educate and reach out through eclectic deconstructing methodologies such as critical thinking, peace education, hope education, storytelling, art-based pedagogies, and visualizations. So now I'm talking about, like, we need to be eclectic in our methods for counter-narratives, right? We should inspire connectedness. That's social psychology. That's social pedagogy. Students should be able to apply what they have learned inside the classroom to various contexts outside the classroom. For example, for critical thinking, we need to challenge what is claimed within each article and then to create a rebuttal. Peace education and hope education may be used to provide an alternative vision of society. In order to achieve that, we can use experiential learning, and that's the means to internalize new values, attitudes, and skills. Storytelling, for example, engage both the teller and the recipient in a collaborative process of making meaning and constructing values of empathy and tolerance while deconstructing myths, misconceptions, and stereotypes. In one of our projects, in Project Someone, we had a documentary called The Dark Side of Social Media, where we interviewed people to tell their stories of how they battled online social media. And you should imagine, like, the ripple effect that we had around our community, where people wanted to share and wanted to learn about the stories of others. Last but not least, art-based pedagogies is also another example. It's much more than a means to an end. Art is much more a means to an end. It's a valuable research tool that can be used to explore, embody, and express complex and challenging social phenomena such as resilience. The creative use of art and narrative to illuminate the experience and communicate findings to a wider audience is irreplaceable. Art, for example, I always give the example of, I don't know if you've seen it, the installation art by JR, which basically portrays the figure of the child overlooking the Mexican and US border. And when you look at that picture, you can't help but see the child as a human. Like, you can't help but humanize the child and deconstruct the myths and the stereotypes behind that. So that's the power of using art in counter-narratives. And I believe it's underused, and we need to use it more often. Now, we need to be open, engaging, interconnecting to tackle the issue from different perspectives and different angles and begin to deconstruct some of the complexities behind these phenomena. Now again, like the point before the last, I'm going to talk about how it's important to diversify our attention and not only talk about or express all these different projects that you can see from, there are pages on projectsomeone.ca, just visuals to accompany. If you have time, please go ahead and go to projectsomeone.ca. We need to understand, critically analyze, and then attempt to solve economic complexities, political complexities, citizenship issues, even emerging low self-efficacy. So that's why we need to raise consciousness all over. And when I say all over, it's not only with radicalized groups or disenfranchised groups, because small traumas that happen every day actually could accumulate into big traumas. So that's why when we spread awareness or when we spread counter-narratives, we need to spread it to the whole population. It's not only targeted toward disenfranchised populations. So we do that in Montreal, in our project. We do that, we for example, go around different communities and we teach them awareness towards counter-narratives for violent extremism through simply going through, for example, a visualization technique or any other technique. And it is really like producing ripple effects, and they are really understanding the different importance of being a cohesive community. Lastly, all interventions need to be evaluated, assessed by their impacts on the community. Did this intervention help or not the disenfranchised citizens? Sometimes an intervention may not be beneficial. We may not be able to tweak it or even cancel it or replace it by something else. But it's important to measure, like, was it actually beneficial? Was this intervention beneficial? Did it, and most importantly, before I say this is the last thing, before I wrap up, is the gender focus. Like gender, when we talk about counter-narratives, gender tends to take backseat, but it shouldn't, because gender could be a cause and a consequence of de-radicalization. A cause because, like, gender, when we combine gender with the intricacies of violence, it produces something super complex. And it could be a consequence because at the same time, de-radicalized groups or even radicalized groups may recruit women banking on or taking advantage of the popular beliefs that women are passive or defenseless in the face of violence. So we shouldn't really take backseat when we go to gender, and we make sure it's evaluated, prioritized, or else we will never advance. We will be half strong as a population. In light of the above, to evaluate the roles of women in the planning, developing, and implementing and evaluative of counter-terrorism initiatives is also of ultimate importance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jihan, for your thoughts, especially for the last one about gender. I guess it needs more discussion because it's an important important thing. Now we'll be listening to Ms. Karolina Lindholm. She has served as Deputy Representative for UNHCR in Lebanon since January 2017. She has worked with the UNHCR since 1999. Please, floor for you.
Thank you very much. And a warm thanks to the Canadian Embassy and the Issam Fares Institute for inviting UNHCR to speak and for organizing this conference on a topic that really preoccupies UNHCR every day, not only in Lebanon, but actually in every country where we work. Currently, UNHCR works in 130 countries around the world, and to provide international protection to refugees and help find durable solutions to their transitory situation of refuge. And just worldwide today, there are 65.6 million people forcibly displaced, out of whom 22.5 million are refugees in a country abroad, while more than 40 million are displaced internally within their country's borders. So, and many of the refugees around the world are in a situation where tensions are rising in the community and facing protection challenges as a result every day. Lebanon is, as we all know, one of the countries in the world that has most directly witnessed and experienced the impact of this global forced displacement tragedy, which it is. Today, Lebanon hosts around 1 million registered Syrian refugees and an unknown number of unregistered Syrians who are in Lebanon in need of international protection, plus around 20,000 refugees of other nationalities, mainly Iraqis, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. So Lebanon is the country in the world that hosts the highest number of refugees per capita. And if we look specifically at the Syrian refugee population, 7 years into the conflict, we see that the vulnerabilities of the Syrian refugees continues to rise. Very soon, the annual vulnerability assessment of Syrian refugees, the VASIR, as we abbreviate it, will be released. And it shows that 76% of the households are now living below the poverty line of $3.84 per person per day. And this is an increase from 71% living below the poverty line in the previous year. 58% of the Syrian refugee families are living below the extreme poverty line. Thanks to the support from the international community in terms of providing assistance, we have managed to slow down the decrease or the drop in the decrease in or increase, I should say, in vulnerabilities. But the fact that the funding available for basic assistance for refugees only manages to reach 17% actually of Syrian households to provide them with a monthly multi-purpose cash assistance. This means that the majority of refugee families are not receiving a multi-purpose cash assistance that they use in order to pay their rent, basic household items and food. And this, of course, together with limited livelihood opportunities, contributes to a rise in vulnerabilities as the years go by. We also see that around 90% of the Syrian refugee households have an average debt of $857 per household. And these are debts to landlords, to shop owners, and others that they have accumulated over the years. And in response to this situation, we see an increased number of refugee families adopting negative coping strategies, such as reducing their food intake, selling productive assets, selling property back home in Syria, or, for example, taking their children out of school and sending them to work in order to help the family make ends meet. Another factor that currently adds to the difficult situation of many of the Syrian refugee families is the fact that only 26% of Syrians who are 15 years and above have a valid residence permit at the moment. And if you don't have a valid residence permit, your ability to move freely without being afraid of arrest and detention is restricted. Of course, there was a very positive development earlier this year when the government took a decision to waive the fee of $200 per Syrian refugee registered with UNHCR in order for them to renew their residency. But still, there is a very high number who have not yet been able to legalize their stay, which continues to also impact on their socioeconomic situation and their vulnerability to protection risks. But at the same time, it's, as I'm focusing on the vulnerabilities and the kind of facts and figures of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, it is very important to really acknowledge and recognize that the impact on Lebanese local communities of hosting so many refugees over so many years is really becoming increasingly evident. I think in the previous panel, Dr. Khalil Gebara mentioned that many of the municipalities hosting the largest numbers of refugees are among the most economically deprived municipalities. But some of these have had their population doubled or even tripled due to the arrival of so many Syrian refugees. So it's obvious that that has a huge impact on the local infrastructure and services. I mean, I personally met with many mayors in municipalities hosting large numbers of refugees who have, very vividly described how the Lebanese in their municipalities open their homes and share their meals and their electricity and their water with the Syrians when they arrived, and did so for a very long time. But that the mayors and the local authorities are now very worried about how to maintain the hospitality of their constituents and of their communities after so many years, when people feel frustration or impatience with a protracted situation. And conflicts are even arising over things like where to bury your dead. I mean, some mayors have, in the Bekaa in particular, have described that tensions are rising between Lebanese and Syrians over not finding places to bury your dead because the graveyards are full, or mayors having to tell their farmers not to use the water in the taps to irrigate their crops because it will not make the crops good for consumption. And I think it goes without saying that when people are faced with these daily realities, it creates frustration and fuels tensions. And I mean, I worked for UNHCR in Europe between 2012 and 2016, when Europe was faced with an increased number of refugees arriving, and witnessed firsthand how tensions rose there in communities over due to the fact that there were more kids in the local schools or in the communities, even though the numbers of refugees who arrived to European countries was, of course, much, much smaller than the numbers that have arrived to the Lebanese host communities. So, as was said before by previous speakers, it is actually quite remarkable that the situation has been so stable until now. But the rise that we are seeing, especially this year, in social tensions is really a concern to everyone, including, or not least, the Syrian refugees. I mean, when we speak with them on a daily basis, they express a real worry about tensions rising, because they say it's the stability of Lebanon that enabled them to find protection here from persecution and war and conflict. It's the stability of Lebanon that they have relied on for their protection. So they're worried when they see tensions rising, and sometimes feel guilty over their presence. And many are saying that they feel increasingly unwelcomed by host communities and squeezed. So what we have been doing, I mean, together with partners is, I mean, UNDP in particular, but also UNHCR and with relevant ministries, trying to map tensions, increases in social tensions in various communities, in order to identify trends and use this as an early warning mechanism, so that interventions can be made before tensions rise to the level where it escalates into a conflict. And these surveys that we're conducting show that actually some interesting findings are that tensions are often actually less in areas where there is more interaction between the communities. And I also know from European countries where similar studies were made in 2015, 2016, that was the same, that it was not always in the communities that hosted most refugees where the tensions were higher, or actually it was often quite the opposite. So one initiative or something that can be done is initiatives that really foster interaction between communities, and in particular youth, which was also mentioned earlier. UNDP stabilization surveys also show that there is not always a direct correlation between areas with a high presence of refugees and dissatisfaction over service provision, which and findings that seem to point to the importance of addressing perceptions, and this was also mentioned earlier. I think one perception that we have seen in public discussion recently is that Syrians have contributed to increasing crime in the society. But in fact, it is important to note that according to figures from the relevant ministries, Syrians make up 25% of the prison population, which is actually corresponds to their presence in the community, or the percentage in the community. We also see in the public debate discussions around refugees being associated with terrorism and linked to terrorism, when in fact refugees are often the first victim, the actual victims of terrorism, which is why, or terror attacks, which is why they have fled. And where it is important to remember that under international law, refugees are civilian by definition. But these perceptions, I think, as was said by one of the previous speakers, it is really important to ensure that these anecdotes do not become facts. I think it was the Canadian ambassador who said that in her opening, but to address perceptions with real facts and figures. These surveys, just the last point, also show that the sources of tensions are very much around competition over jobs, or perceived competition over jobs. And another measure, therefore, that is important to take is initiatives that stimulate job creation while also continuing to provide support for refugees to meet their basic needs. So in order to remove the causes of competition over jobs. And finally, another, I think, if one looks at then what one can do to address the different factors. So I think it's a combination of actions which include fact and evidence-based reporting, activities that foster inter-community interaction, initiatives and projects that address root causes of tensions like competition over jobs, and support to the response through the national institutions where possible, so that when the international communities is helping Lebanon to respond to the refugee crisis, it at the same time helps to strengthen the national institutions, so that we also leave something behind that is there after the refugees have been able to find durable solutions outside of Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these fresh figures. I guess it raises a lot of questions, especially that if Lebanon doesn't deal with it right, it may generate cycles of violence and affect the relations between the Lebanese and the Syrians in the future relations. Thank you very much. Now we'll be listening to Dr. Ziad Saigh. Dr. Ziad is a researcher on Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, peace negotiations in the Middle East, and on Syria displaced, and labor policies and social protection. Please.
Thank you. Good morning. I know very well that we are focusing on the refugees and displaced situation. I will try to balance now with the host community's concerns and challenges. Because if we want to decrease tensions, we should take into consideration both concerns and both problems. I think we are focusing on describing and trying to solve the problems of refugees in terms of a humanitarian approach, socio-economic approach, legal approach in the host countries and the host communities, but we are neglecting really to think deeply what was behind their displacement and who pushed them to leave their countries, and how we can create a framework to help them to return back to their homelands in dignity, in security, with guarantees based on international standards. On the other hand, we should read well what are the concerns of the host communities and why we have tensions now. Why we have tensions between Lebanese and Syrians, and before between Lebanese and Palestinian refugees. Because of the lack of resources? Yes. Lebanon is a small country. We have a lack of resources. Because of the lack of tolerance? Maybe. But I think we should move from talking about tolerance to talking about partnership and responsibility. Let's move from advocacy approach to a partnership on responsibility. The advocacy became very traditional. I think both Lebanese and Syrians, Palestinian and Lebanese, are victims. We are victims of a very difficult situation. The key issue is that we have two critical lacks. First of all, in Lebanon, we have a lack of good governance of the crisis situation we are facing. But we have in the international community also a lack of building an efficient political process to solve the key problem. The key problem now became the tensions between Lebanese and Syrians, but we are really neglecting that the key problem is the massacres of the Syrian regime and the terrorism vis-à-vis the Syrian people. The international community is focusing on the relief intervention, and we need this. This is key. The UNHCR, for example, and or the UN agencies are deploying a huge efforts to try to support the displaced. In the case of the Palestinian refugees, the UNRWA is working on. But this is not enough. What we need also is to try to think how we can support the host communities. And here also there is efforts deployed by the international community, by the Lebanese government, but it is not enough because we are not solving the key problem. We are solving the symptoms. And why we have tensions also? How you can now talk about Lebanese people and Syria displaced relation without taking into consideration 30 years of Syria occupation and Lebanon? There is a collective memory. And how we can think, how should be the Lebanese people and the Syria displaced relation in the coming 30 years, taking into consideration all this change in the region. This is also a key issue. Can we balance between humanitarian and sovereign? Yes, we can. Lebanon is respecting the human rights of every human being on his land. And Lebanon is concerned also in protecting its people and its land through a national security framework. And I think it's time. It's a challenge for us as Lebanese people, Lebanese government, to think more on the human security approach more than on security approach. And I agree with Karolina when she mentioned that trying to connect the Syria displaced in Lebanon with the terrorism and with the criminalities is very dangerous, but it's a kind of a political agenda behind this. All the narrative and all the media discussion we faced since 6 months in Lebanon was not about facilitating the return of Syria displaced. It was behind on trying to disseminate a political agenda more than the return of the Syria displaced. I will not go in details on this agenda. I think everybody knows well what is this agenda. Why we have tensions also? The Lebanese government till now didn't succeed to create a kind of political consensus on the public policy. Since 4 weeks, the last meeting of the Interministerial Committee was a kind of muhawali, yes, to get consensus. And the paper prepared by the Ministry of State for Displaced Affairs was approved. But in the last 15 minutes, there was a disagreement and another paper came on the table as a surprise. All the policy paper was based on the non-refoulement principle, And the paper appearing in the last minute was based on the refoulement. And in the media, the second day, we were surprised to read that this is a victory, that there is another paper based on the refoulement. This is a kind of politicization and populism, and this is creating tensions. The problem is political in Lebanon. It's not about Lebanese people. It's about political agendas. And I'm not mentioning all the political agendas. I will be very clear about one political agenda. To finish, I have 4 problematic questions. Do you think it is possible to solve a political and security crisis with a socio-economic approach? Are we aware that we are facing now a crisis of identity more than a crisis of humanitarian relief? How we can complement the relief intervention and for the refugees, for the displaced, and the development intervention for the host communities? And can we elaborate more on the process of return, but in thinking very well when and how and through which guarantees? I don't know. My last comment is, if we want to reduce tensions now and to maintain the Lebanese stability, we should refer more to the public policies. And we don't have public policies in Lebanon. And we should think more on the tragedy of the commons and how we can have good governance, because we have a lack of resources at all levels in Lebanon. And I think also we should be convinced that the political process in building peace is crucial. Unfortunately, in all the seminars and roundtables we are attending now, the focus is more on the humanitarian issue than the political issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When I was listening for your presentation, I just thought that the international community is dealing with the Syrian situation as if there was an earthquake in Syria. There was an earthquake, and these refugees left Syria for an earthquake, not for other reasons. And you are right at this point. Also, the part regarding the good governance is essential because, as you said, one of the major problems is not with how the Lebanese communities were dealing with refugees, is related with the narrative was presented by the Lebanese politicians and Lebanese media, which is affected by the Lebanese politicians. Now we'll move on and listen to Dr. Nasser Yassin. Dr. Yassin is the Director of Research at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, and the Assistant Professor of Policy and Planning at the Department of Health Management and Policy at the Faculty of Health Sciences and at the AUB. Please, Dr. Yassin.
Thank you, Zahir. I'll actually try to continue from where Ziad ended and where Karolina and other colleagues have been trying to address, but particularly why there is tension. And the question that always comes to mind that in the 6 years into the crisis, why tension has been in my opinion, manufactured and constructed by particularly politicians, but also the media, and how it's been made or in the making, and particularly in the last six months. And it always, makes me pause and ask the question. I mean, for the last 6 years until recently, the question could have been a question of celebration that Lebanon has been coping with this, large demographic increase of destitute, displaced people who actually fled war and misery in their country. I mean, the question could have been reversed in a way: why Lebanon and how Lebanon has been coping with this change in its society and demography, particularly by poor displaced coming to the country. So I'm not politicizing it, but I'm trying to pose actually and unpack the coping of Lebanon and particularly its society. But unfortunately, we've started to see recently signs of fatigue, and these could explain partly the tension that we've been witnessing in the last few months. And I'll look into 3 types of fatigue. The first fatigue is actually fatigue from Syria and fatigue in Syria. I mean, 7 years into the war, there is fatigue from Syria, but there's also fatigue in Syria. And that could have, explained the current half-baked solution that's being cooked at the moment, or half-cooked in Syria. That's part of actually explaining how the world has been moving from Syria, how the international community perhaps has been less and less interested in having a solid solution for the Syrian people. But also there's a donor fatigue, and we see it now in Lebanon happening. There's a donor fatigue where only Lebanon received, I think Karolina can correct me, mid-year, in 2017, we received 30% less than what the UN and other non-governmental actors have pledged to and have requested to. So there is less resources coming to support the response. I'm going to say it as a response, regardless of whether it's humanitarian or resilience building, but the response. But these actually would take me to the community, to the host community fatigue, and that's the essence of the presentation today. I mean, there is signs or perceptions that the host communities are going through fatigue. It could be natural after 7 years of seeing, this large increase happening around their households. You see some fatigue, but I think I'd like to deconstruct the narrative that has been put in the last few months to manufacture further these perceptions of tension and fatigue among the host communities. I'm not denying that there is fatigue in the host community, particularly in certain areas, and I'll show towards the end how to understand this fatigue. But actually, in the last few months, we've been seeing a narrative, and I'd like to unpack it together, particularly, as Ziad put it, to really actually to gain electoral capital. I mean, that's it, because why we didn't see it a year ago, why we only saw it in the last few months, and why actually mainstream media has changed in the way they started to look into the Syrian displacement in Lebanon. And actually, if we unpack it, we can unpack it into 3 dimensions. And I think Dr. Mitri mentioned this early on today. The exaggerating the effect and impact of displacement, the generalization that we get all the time, and spreading fear among the host communities in Lebanon and host societies in Lebanon. And I'll go one by one to explain and give examples, actually, how these 3 dimensions of this narrative have been used, and have been used, in a false way, mostly using, false facts or falsehood or fake, ways of looking at it. And let me start with the demographics. In a place like Lebanon, and these 3 actually, they're used interlinked together, so one actually leads to other in many ways. Let me talk about the exaggeration. The figure that we always give as an example, some newspaper and TV news were spreading that there are 300,000 births every year in Lebanon. I mean, that cannot happen. It cannot happen in any way. I mean, you look into the hospitals in Lebanon, you look into the current demography in Lebanon, this will never happen, perhaps in many, many, many years, because we will actually plateau at some point. And if you actually get a bit of demography, we would plateau in terms of demographic increase. So we will never get 300,000 births in our lifetime in Lebanon, or in the lifetime of our kids. But anyway, I mean, the figure was true. It was 300,000 births in the region. 300,000 Syrian kids were born in displacement in the region. But the way it's being used, and this is actually the essence of deconstructing this narrative, it's used to show that in Lebanon there are 300,000 words. We were in a seminar with Ziad, and some figure in the country would say, "Look around you, all the Syrians are pregnant." I mean, that's actually how we draw perceptions among us. Of course, the numbers are high. I'm not denying it. I mean, the number of birth is high, of course, because of certain socio-economic, sociological, and consideration for the communities of Syrians who came into Lebanon. We have to understand this. But anyway, that's not 300,000 per year. It's on average, as Karolina would attest, maybe around 24,000 to 27,000 a year. Maybe it has increased over time, but not exceeding 35,000 at a highest peak in a year. So that's actually 10% of the figure that's been put out. So that's the first number about the exaggeration, but also exaggeration about the economic impact, and linking it again. It's always starts from an actual reality, from a real figure and evidence, but misused in a horrendous way. And the economic impact of the Syrian refugee crisis versus the economic impact of the Syria crisis. So of course there's a drop in the gross development and the GDP growth in Lebanon, but that actually has to do with a lot of considerations related to the slow economy in the region, to the situation in Syria, to the situation in the Gulf. I mean, all of these come together, and that actually has caused a drop, not the Syrian refugees themselves. As a matter of fact, if you look deep and understand how the Syrian refugees are contributing, they do contribute in the range of $1.25 to $2 billion a year. I mean, those are poor and destitute, yet through the consumption, because they're mostly families, they're mostly women and children, and they're consuming, they actually contribute to some local economic growth at the local level at least. We cannot go into the details where it's happening, but through the consumption we see some slight contribution to the economy. Again, I mean, we're countering this by telling that we cannot just exaggerate in such way. We need to look into those figures and understand them. But the second dimension we unpack this narrative is about generalization. And the best would be that Syrians are taking the jobs from the Lebanese. Of course there is competition, and I'll highlight this towards the end. But when we look at the figures from the vulnerability assessment and survey that's done by the UN and the government in Lebanon, actually you find that only 6% of working adult Syrians have started their small businesses. And perhaps that has been also the trend before the crisis, because Syrians have actually started small businesses within their communities, fruit and vegetable shops here, some hairdressers there, and so on and so forth. But it's not the 94% who are actually still working mostly in basic jobs that they used to occupy before the crisis. But if I want to generalize further, that actually most Syrians in Lebanon don't deserve aid, and they actually come here, pick the money, and go back to Syria. And I've actually heard it several times in discussions, but also sometimes in the media, sometimes in seminars like this. But I mean, just Karolina mentioned, they're getting poorer. 76% are getting poorer. So I think this is a false claim that they are here and just for the meager assistance that they get from the UN and other NGOs. 3 minutes of, okay. The third point is around spreading fear, and particularly, touches on the demographic fear, or what I call demographic phobia among the Lebanese communities or part of the Lebanese community. The demographic phobia from each other in Lebanon. So, of course, we tend to fear if there's 1 million Syrian are in Lebanon, but that's actually how it's being used. But I want to touch on briefly that most of the Syrians can carry arms. There are 300,000 men. They can actually all train in the army, in the Syrian army, and they can carry arms and occupy Lebanon. As a matter of fact, you only need 10 armed people to put a city to its hold, actually. I mean, we see it. I mean, you don't need 300,000 fighters. 100 fighters can occupy a city with the current warfare and the new wars. Criminals, I think Karolina mentioned the criminology, where actually we looked into the data from the Ministry of Interior, and only 0.05% of those detained in the last year, 2016, Syrians detained, were actually homicide or serious crimes. So most of them are related to lack of documents or actually being captured because they haven't renewed their residency. That's how these figures are used in this narrative that's being constructed to create fear among the host communities. Well, I'm not denying that we are issues, but I want to actually, the first step in looking into understanding the burden on Lebanon by the displacement or the crisis of displacement is contextualizing it. We need to contextualize, and that's a figure that I've always used in each seminar. When we look at that 87% of those poor Syrians are living among the poorest Lebanese, where 67% of the poorest Lebanese live, in Biqa, in Baalbek, in Barelias, in Akkar, in the suburbs of the city, you would actually understand that we have a crisis of poverty that's been accentuated by displacement. It's a geography of poverty through the geography of displacement that we got this recipe that we see now. Those areas, Ziad, have been neglected historically from the state.
Yes.
I mean, if you actually were in Tabbani or in Hermel or in Bibnin or any other area, you'd understand that those areas have been neglected historically from the state. And now you have more refugees coming because of the informal nature of settling there and renting houses and working and so on. So actually, when we talk about my next point, targeting the work of response around most of the important issues that's been around youth unemployment and the competition between young Syrians and young Lebanese, you would understand that those areas, this geography of poverty in Lebanon has been neglected historically from the state, has actually never in the life of the governments of Lebanon, in any ministerial, any government, position they make in the parliament, al-Bayan al-Wizari, have made the issue of making jobs or creating jobs for the youth, particularly in those areas, as a priority. So we've been historically neglected, and now we see the Syrians coming. Of course, they want to look for any job, so they will be competing with some of those Lebanese who are outside the formal economy, cannot be in a bank, cannot be in a university, because most Syrians are outside this anyway. And maybe the army is not actually doing, or the police doing any recruitment, so that's why you see some tension in Akkar at the moment, because that's how we constructed a model in Akkar, that you get all those people to go to the army, rather than go and work around the productive economy there and create some jobs for the youth. So of course, if you put all of these in context, you would understand that we are getting into a recipe that actually would lead to tension. Look at the context that's in Lebanon. You look at how the narrative has been manufactured in Lebanon for the last few months and the past year. You look into the situation of the poor Lebanese, and definitely things are what to do. And I think, and I will end with this, Thair. So I think we need to get back to some kind of, really, as Ziad mentioned, into a political discussion of the situation in the higher sense of politics. We actually, instead of showing Lebanon, showing the Lebanese, showing Syrians, showing the world that Lebanon can cope with this huge crisis and can teach everyone how to cope with such crisis until Syrians go back to their country, we opted for actually politically regressive position on displacement. But I tell you what, that's a position that we've always held against Palestinians in Lebanon. I mean, Palestinians are barred from working in many jobs. They're encamped. They cannot go out, and we apply a security lens to them.
No, they can go out.
Yeah, they can. I mean, those who, of course, they can go out. But actually, there's a lot of issues around those who have some security issues around their files in Ain Helwi and other places. Anyway, that's another discussion. But actually, if you look at the way we've always dealt in a politically regressive position around immigrants, we actually see the same. The way we treat our migrant workers is the same, actually. We lock them in houses, we confiscate their passports, we don't allow them out. So we are, in many ways, in an institutional void, and in an institution that actually discriminates against a lot of those we want to put them in the margin. Fortunately or unfortunately, Syrians are in a high number that we cannot put them in the margin. So that's actually, we've been facing all this narrative against them in this visible way. But actually, let me take you further. If a woman, Lebanese woman, is married to a non-Lebanese, she will be actually treated the same. If we don't address those institutional discriminations that we have in the country against a lot of the populations that we've been hosting in the country, and we come up with something that's enlightened and looking into those who are different from the Lebanese, from us, we would actually be in the same thing. We would be in the same aspect of actually creating the narrative of civil war. So actually, that's what I want to end with. If we don't address those institutions that discriminate against immigrants, refugees, women who are married to non-Lebanese, lesbian and gay community, and on, we would actually be in the same thing. And I will end with a story. I mean, I'll name it. The mayor of Dequani has bragged about being one of the most militant against Syrian refugees. I know his name, but he's been actually chasing them out, closing their businesses, going on media and saying, that's what I do, I'm protecting my... But actually, he had the same against the lesbian and gay community when he closed their bar a few years ago. And actually, he had the same when he brags around fighting Palestinians, and of course, Palestinians were fighting in the war and so on. That's another story. If we don't address this narrative of discrimination, we would be actually be reproducing the same narrative of the Civil War. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Sorry for the speakers trying to be strict, but I was asked to do that. So we have around 20 to 25 minutes for the discussion. Just a small note: we are treating also the refugees as we treat ourselves at the secretarial level. Yani now, if we look to the Palestinian refugees, they were divided into Muslim Palestinian refugees and Christian Palestinian refugees. And they dealt with the Christians different than the Muslims. And now the same is happening with the Syrians, and the same happened with the Iraqi refugees. Now, for example, one of the things that one of the major political parties in Lebanon is doing is trying to give Lebanese citizenship to a group of Syrian and Iraqi and Palestinian refugees who are Christian, not Muslims. So they believe that will demographical balance, they will get it back again. So we have around 20 to 25 minutes for questions. We'll begin with 3 questions and then get the answers and other 3 questions. Who would like to begin? Please.
Thank you. I had a question. If the people from the Lebanon are, and the refugees as well are considered as the victims, and the political system is considered as a failing system, who's going to act then? Because if you're the victim, then you have to blame someone, and if you blame the person, you're not going to really work on your own fate. So if you place the two and on different fronts, who's actually going to work in the middle to reduce the tensions there?
Thank you. First of all, here. It's okay. My question goes to you first. I just heard that you mentioned we have like 1 million Syrian refugees. I guess we have like over 2 million with the newborns. And this is really clear. And we don't think we can be able to stay like this. We have to set a new strategy for the Syrian and refugees and displaced to give them all the facilities to send them back to Syria, of course, with security. And we might need like Security Council or the international community. We cannot wait forever. We cannot feed them. We cannot wait till the international games plays all around, because we are also victims for all these issues. Thank you.
I have 2 points. First, concerning the waiver that was done on the fees for the renewal that was stated. It's true that there was a free renewal for some of the refugees, but the idea is that the decisions that are being done, they are not for everyone. So the decision is very general, and it's very restricting to a specific group of people. It's not only for those registered, it's for those registered with UNHCR, with many other restrictions and rules for the renewal to be done. So this is a failure, if you want to say, from the government in taking the right decision and the right practice and in applying these decisions amongst GSOs, because everyone applies it in the way he wants or the way the GSO wants. So we have to take responsibility on that point. The other thing is mainly related to looking at the tensions from a micro level perspective. When we're, okay, it's true that there are economical factors and everything, but if you look now at the tensions that are happening, especially in Beirut, Mount Lebanon area, it's on a macro level perspective. All the municipalities are not poor municipalities; they are Christian municipalities, and it's a political thing. It's not a political. It's not an economical thing. So we also need to take action on that, because it's advocacy apparently is not really working, and we need to take it to the next level, I believe.
Okay, who would like to begin? Please.
We don't have 2 million Syria displaced. Let's be very clear. Historically, we have in Lebanon between 400,000 and 600,000 Syrian workers. This is historically. Add to them their families. We have 1 million registered, and if we have another 300,000 or 400,000 unregistered, we have 1.5. We don't have 2 millions. We did the same mistake in the Palestinian refugees figures. We have politicians now in Lebanon, they are still talking about 600,000 Palestinian refugees. And now there is an exercise now led by the Lebanese Palestinian Dialogue Committee. And the results till now, in the camps we have around 300,000 or 280,000. That's it. Let's try to avoid spreading wrong figures to disseminate a political agenda. This is not healthy. This will destroy the country. This is like someone said in the last crisis, if Europe will not intervene to help us in the Prime Minister crisis, we will open the door to the refugees to go to Europe. Crazy. This is a foreign policy? Second, if there is a kind of exploitation of a sectarian element in approaching the Palestinian refugees and the Syria displaced crisis, this is also destructive. Yes, I agree, there is a Christian municipalities now moving based on political agenda. To be very clear, this is unethical, this is against theology, and this is against Christianity. And if someone now is still convinced that in Lebanon there is communities, and to be very simple and clear, the Sunnite community want these people to stay in Lebanon, this is also very destructive. This is not the case. The area on which the Syria displaced are based are the poorest areas, and the most of these areas are Sunnis. Let's stop talking like this. We have a problem, yes, but we should blame ourselves that since the beginning of this crisis, someone also refused to organize the presence of the Syria displaced in Lebanon. And the same someone is trying now to tell us these people should go back and now. And another one who contributed in pushing these people to leave their homelands are showing the flag that these people should go back and now. I think the Kalamoon area is مثال صارخ، بدي أقولها بالعربي أفضل، مثال صارخ على أنه في حدا هجر الناس من هاي المنطقة وفي يرجعهم وما بده يرجعهم وعم بخبرنا أنه نحن لازم نرجعهم. بكفي بقى كذب على بعضنا البعض. This is the time to revisit our framework and to go back to the logic of policies and to stop this politicization of this crisis.
Okay, thank you. I think, yes, there were some questions for UNHCR as well. I think I'll start with your question about first the numbers. I did mention in my presentation that there are around, or actually slightly less than 1 million Syrian refugees registered with UNHCR, plus an unknown number of unregistered, because since 2015, UNHCR has been requested to suspend registration of Syrians approaching our office. So the government estimate in the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan is 1.5 million, but we actually don't know the real figure. And UNHCR would very much like to resume registration because we think it's in everyone's interest to know actually the real number of refugees on the territory, so that the response and the support can be adapted to meet the real needs. In terms of the number of refugees born, since 2011, around 130,000 children have been born to Syrian refugees registered with UNHCR. So 130,000 since 2011, which is the figure. On the issue of return, first, I would like to say that we've done a number of surveys, discussions with and focus group discussions and individual interviews with Syrian refugees, especially during the course of this year. And the overwhelming majority say that they dream of returning to Syria. That's what they want. They're not intending and wanting to stay permanently in Lebanon. They dream of going back, and they're watching the situation very closely to see how it's developing and which areas are becoming more secure. But what they do say is that the main factor that's preventing them from returning today is that they don't trust that the security is sustainable, is stable yet, because they see, 1 month, one area being safe, there being a ceasefire, but then the next month there is again bombings and shelling and violence in that area and people fleeing. And in fact, since the beginning of this year, more than 1 million Syrians have been freshly or newly displaced within their country. So there are actually more people being newly displaced in Syria today than people who are spontaneously returning. But this does not mean that the refugees are not watching the situation closely and hoping and getting ready to return the day it is safe to do so in a dignified way, and they can trust that the return is permanent and not that you go back and then a week later you have to leave again in order to save yourself and your families. But of course, they are impatient, and as I think many of us have said today, we understand that the Lebanese local communities are impatient, because 6 years of hosting so many people is a long time, especially as many of us, including not least the refugees themselves, thought that this would be a short conflict that would be over maybe in 6 months or a year or 2 years, and now we're into the 7th year. So, still small-scale returns are taking place. On the waiver of the residents, indeed, the waiver that was announced in March this year only covers those who are registered with UNHCR before the suspension of registration in 2015. And it also excludes refugees who have renewed based on sponsorship or tourism or visa. It shouldn't exclude their families, though. But we do see, I know that organizations that are monitoring the practice see that not all refugees who should benefit from the waiver are able to do so in practice. So this is something we need to work on. And then there was also one of the commitments in the Brussels conference this year was to expand the waiver to include all of the Syrians, because again, this lack of legal residency is really putting them at greater risk of arrests and detention and exploitation. Plus, it leads to the Lebanese authorities not, again, knowing who is actually on the territory of the country. By expanding, legal residency to everyone, the authorities would know who is on the territory. Then, finally, just on this issue, Ziad already addressed it, but the municipalities where evictions are taking place, from the refugees' perspective, they are very, very anxious. We have the situation in Bishara in the north, for example, where the only school that operates a so-called second shift for Syrian students has been closed since the beginning of the school year. So you have more than 100 Syrian kids who haven't been able to go to school now for weeks. And they have a right to education, and they need this education. So we're hoping that municipalities will not proceed with these evictions, because it also creates problems for neighboring municipalities that are already hosting large numbers. Thanks.
Dr. Jihan, any comment? Dr. Nasser, any comment?
We'll take another.
Okay, let's take another round of questions, please. It's the last round, please, there.
Okay, let's leave aside the political framework and let's look at the social framework. As we all know, Lebanese citizens are not benefiting from a lot of services, and I want to recall the access of services, especially the infrastructure, water and sanitation, electricity, and the problem of garbage. In your opinion, these social, let's say, problems, daily problems that Lebanese are facing, and not only Syrians as well are facing, are they contributing to increasing tensions or not? In my opinion, honestly speaking, this is one issue we need to address before dealing with the sectarian balance or not, the settlements, because this situation is, we can consider it as protracted situation. It's been 6 years and now it's the 7th. So mainly people are suffering from traffic, from pollution, from problems of services, health services. So these are mainly issues that we need to tackle, leave aside the political framework, which is really a messy business.
Please, but please be short questions, please.
Yes, it's true that some tension comes from political discourse, but it should not be shaped, because sometimes we have reality that we have to face. If you have a very poor family in our sales and asking for fuel in winter, and if they say, why Syrians are having fuel and we are also poor like Syrian, can you accuse them of being radical? Of course not. So you have to listen to what they say. An international community, I think, have to address this issue, because part of the tension is created by the international community, because the Lebanese needs were not addressed properly. They have been addressed only symbolically to say that we are supporting Lebanese, but we are not supporting the needs of needy people. Thank you.
Okay. Last question? Okay, no. There, please.
Regarding the comments about municipalities evicting some refugees and so on, in the grand scheme of things, those are very small minorities. And I think, to Dr. Sayer's point, I think we should give the Lebanese a round of applause, because given that the far right is on the rise in the US, in Britain, in Europe, the Lebanese have shown a high level of tolerance, I think. And the things you brought up are really minor in the grand scheme of things, don't you think?
Okay, let's begin with Dr. Nasser, but let's try to be
very
short.
briefly.
Yeah.
I think the question about access to services and Dr. Rami's question on the realities, I think they're very good points. And I mean, the way I think the way it's been framed as host communities with the refugees was something quite good to do. I mean, that's not in the narrative and the approach of humanitarian organizations to look into host communities. So the first few years were a disaster. You know, they're just going into following the refugees in a very humanitarian response way. So, but you're right. But we shouldn't actually forget that those Arsel and other places have been historically neglected. Yani we cannot now put the blame on the human development and social development on the international community. It's part. But this is there's a social contract between us citizens and the state that we should always bring back. Yani we shouldn't actually put now the blame that there are refugees, and so the international community should actually help them. This is the responsibility of our state. كمان we shouldn't ننسى هذا, we shouldn't forget this issue. إنه أنت you in بعلبك or وسبقة or عكار or تباني or نبعة, you've been historically neglected from your state. So we should also bring back this issue of integrative or holistic development to everyone.
And I will add another question from the last round of questions related to who will be in the middle between the victim and the failed state. Who can be in the middle?
I will start by the last question. The mediator, the mediator is the public policy. It's very clear. Let's go to the scientific approach. The public policy. The balance between humanitarian and sovereignty. Well, this is the mediator. All the problems raised now are connected to a bad governance. That's it. Of course, we have a lack of resources. I mentioned this in my first question. The tensions are about lack of resources. Yes. You know very well this proposal or this framework of Dr. Garrett Hardin about the tragedy of the commons. You can read the article. It was written in 1968. The only problem is the governance. And how we can have good governance if we have a political will. How we can have a serious political will when the decision makers in Lebanon, because unfortunately we don't have policy makers in Lebanon. We don't have policy makers. When these politicians think that we should have a national security framework, the national security is not only about arms. This is about social services. economic prosperity, job creation, social cohesion, governance of pluralism. This is the national security. And when they move also to complement the national security with the human security approach, we can solve this problem. In Europe and in US, this is another case. There they are raising now the problem of identities. In Lebanon, we have somehow this problem, but in terms of sectarian approach. Sunnites, Christian, Maronites, Shias. Good governance with a public policy. I will close with one example. Since 4 to 6 months, in Lebanon started the discussion about the return of the Syria displaced. Someone come to tell us, if we talk to the Syrian regime, these people will go back. Until now, we don't have one declaration from the Syrian regime to invite these people to go back to Syria. Simple. And another one come to tell this camp, you have a Geneva process and you have Astana process. In Geneva and Astana, the Syrian regime is present. Lebanon should go through diplomatic channels. And he should collaborate with the international community under the umbrella of the UN agencies. It's very simple for us. And since 6 months, go to the media, you will see the same narrative. There is people in Lebanon, they don't want these refugees to go back because they are supporting a kind of sectarian imbalance. And they don't want to talk to the regime because they want these people to stay. Give me one example, one constructive example that the Syrian regime, who contributed in pushing these people to leave, one example, even from the UNHCR. If now the UNHCR will ask the Syrian regime, this is my question, that they need to monitor the capacity of return of some refugees to an area. The Syrian regime will allow the UNHCR to go there and to monitor the situation? I don't think. Thank you.
I mean, on your last point, Ziad, I mean, we do, UNHCR has, we have offices in Syria. We're actually increasing our presence there in order to be ready to facilitate reintegration of the refugees when it becomes possible for them to return in safety and dignity. And we do have access, but not to all areas. It's true. We don't have access to Idlib, for example. So it limits our possibility to monitor the fate of those who do return or who are returned.
To Damascus you have?
To Damascus, we have an office in Damascus.
Of course.
But on the other issues, just briefly, I mean, on the issue of the access to services and the pressure on the municipalities, I think it is clear. It is clear that the presence of so many additional people, refugees, in local communities who are using the same roads, the same hospitals, the same schools, the same water pipes and garbage collection is adding to the pressure, and that needs to be compensated for. And I think there, the if we look at the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan, which is really a document or a plan that tries to integrate the humanitarian response with the stabilization and development support, it recognizes fully this, that you cannot support Lebanon in responding to, in mitigating the impact of the presence of refugees without supporting the host communities in developing their infrastructure and also supporting the needs of the poor Lebanese. So this is why this is really a central part of the crisis response plan. We have just updated it, so the new, the updated version that covers, that goes from 2018 will soon be published. And there, the call on the international community to increase its support to Lebanese host communities, national administrations, infrastructure, and support to poor Lebanese is even stronger in that plan, because it sees that this is a critical element of preserving the social stability and preventing tensions from rising. So you're absolutely right. This has to be done.
Thank you very much. If anyone has more questions, you can continue the discussion over the lunch now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
We have 40 minutes for lunch, and then back here.
Thank you, sir.